Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm very pleased to be here. As Rian mentioned, I coordinate the Brexit Civil Society Alliance, and there's basically three things that are really important for us in the Brexit process, and I think that will ring true with a lot of organisations here. And what we really want to see the Brexit process deliver is a protection of rights, protection of standards, proper replacement of EU funding. We want to see that transparent lawmaking and that the Brexit process generally is transparent. We want to see the devolution settlements respected. And we also don't want any governance gap after Brexit. So, as we've sort of been working for the last 3 years, those have been the principles that have been guiding us. And as we look to the kind of the future relationship and some of the main challenges that are facing is there, those are kind of the principles that we see everything through. So I think from our perspective, there are sort of 5 main challenges in the next stage of the negotiations. I think the first one is the lack of time to negotiate a comprehensive trade deal with the EU in 11 months. According to most trade experts, that's a highly ambitious time frame. And given the government's preference for sort of autonomy and diversion from EU rules, and also the government's reluctance to extend the transition period, it is really hard to see how they can get anything other than a bare bones agreement, if that. As Charles mentioned at the beginning, there is still a possibility that we leave without a trade deal at the end of 2020. And I think that is a point that might be a little bit underappreciated, but many of the same impacts that were discussed around no deal back in October, back in March, will still apply if we leave without a trade deal in December 2020. So I think that's sort of the first challenge. The second challenge is the lack of time to actually implement the deal and all the various changes that will arise from Brexit. So the government not only has to agree to a deal, it also has to implement it, and it has to be ready for these changes to kick in by January 1st, 2021. And so the end of the transition period is really when we're going to start to feel the impact of Brexit properly, because now everything's staying the same and we're not really feeling the actual changes yet. And so we'll see changes at the Irish border, we'll see changes across the economy in policy areas like immigration, agriculture, fisheries. And in addition to implementing the deal that is potentially agreed with the EU, the government also has to pass a number of Brexit-related pieces of legislation. They have to set up new bodies to take responsibilities that previously belonged to the EU. So bodies like the Office for Environmental Protections, the Independent Monitoring Authority, which will oversee the implementation of citizens' rights. The government also has to replace EU funding, which Wales have received more of than anywhere else in the UK. And I think particularly on the funding, the absence of detail at this stage is quite worrying. And if the funding is centralised in Westminster, which is a concern for many devolved organisations, priorities may change and the voices of devolved administrations and devolved organisations may not be heard. So the government has a huge task ahead of themselves in the next year in sort of implementing all of these new arrangements and also the deal. And so they might be quite disruptive at the end of 2020, but we shall see. I'm going to avoid making predictions because that goes wrong quite a lot in the Brexit process. But yeah, so I think the third challenge in all of this is the lack of transparency during the negotiations. We have significant concerns about lack of scrutiny from parliamentarians, from the devolved administrations, and from civil society and business. And after the Conservatives won the election, Boris Johnson removed various provisions in the withdrawal agreement bill that was there in the October bill And those provisions concerned parliamentary scrutiny and oversight and approval of the negotiations on the future relationship. So in the original withdrawal agreement bill, there were reasonably strong clauses on the role of Parliament for the future relationship. Now that's all gone, which means that there's huge control in the executive hands in these negotiations. And the reason why it is important that we have sort of parliamentary scrutiny and oversight is that if MPs doesn't have that role, we don't really get a proper say and an input, right? So we're quite concerned about the fact that the executive can kind of go ahead and negotiate this deal without being accountable, really, and not having to publish impact assessments on the deal and things like that. So we will be continuing to push the government on this, and which will be quite important going forward. I think the fourth challenge is, I noticed that I say lack of a lot, but I think what we're really worried about here is that the government just goes full steam ahead without actually consulting with anyone. And that includes engaging with civil society, and it includes engaging with devolved administrations. Previously, we engaged with the Department of Exiting the EU in Whitehall, which was they were tasked with negotiating the first phase of the Brexit deal. The Department of Exiting the EU was shut down on the 31st of January, and negotiations will now be centralised in number 10. And so our concern is that that means that for us as civil society organisations, we won't be able to feed into that process and have our concerns heard. We're also concerned about the lack of engagement with the devolved administrations. Again, in the original withdrawal agreement bill, there was a stronger role for the devolved administrations. That was removed in the new bill. And, issues that are increasingly regulated under free trade agreements are devolved matters like fisheries, agriculture. So it's only appropriate that the devolved administrations have an actual role in the negotiations. But I think what we sort of keep seeing is that the UK government really doesn't listen to the concerns of the devolved administrations. So that is kind of the lack of scrutiny and the lack of engagement is really concerning, because one of our biggest issues at the moment is the potential regression in rights and protections. And so if we don't get to feed into the process, we worry that the UK government is not really going to sign up to a strong level playing field. The EU for a long time has provided a very strong framework for workers' rights, human rights and social protection. I think the challenge now is to get the UK government to sign up to a strong level playing field that sort of underpins the EU-UK trade agreement, and to ensure that rights cannot sort of slip below a basic level. And the reason why we are so concerned about a weakening of rights and protections is because the current government's approach to these policy areas are sort of not alleviating any of the concerns we have. The withdrawal agreement bill that Charles mentioned earlier is a great example of that, because it gives ministers very, very wide powers to amend retained EU law. And so over time, they can start amending, the Workers' Time Directive or other equality protections. So for us, the key thing going forward is really to ensure that the UK signs up to a strong level playing field that actually protects social and labour standards and environmental protections. So I think those are sort of the 5 challenges, and it is quite a bleak overview. So I'm going to try and sort of end on a more positive note, to say that there's lots to be done, and there are lots of things that may cause concern. But I think if there's one thing Brexit has done, is really highlighted the many problems that our country face. Right? Brexit really sort of shone a light on massive regional inequalities, our constitutional shortcomings. And I think now is the time to really start having that conversation about what kind of country we want, and civil society obviously plays a very strong role in that. And I think the other thing that Charles also mentioned was the need to be vigilant about any potential rights, changes to rights and protections. And I think that will be more important than ever, really, for us to sort of come together and speak with one voice about the need to protect these rights, because I think that is a concern across the sector, certainly from what we've been hearing. So I just, would encourage everyone to keep up the fight, really. Also, the other thing, which is sort of a potential opportunity for influence going forward, is the consultation on the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. So for any organisation who receive EU funding and want to have a say in how the Shared Prosperity Fund is actually designed and structured, I would encourage you to respond to the consultation when/if it arrives. So, I think I'll end on that note.